Thanks for being here, and welcome to Adam Pisoni. And thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. Adam is, for those few of you who might not know it, he's the co-founder and chief technology officer of Yammer, the enterprise social network, and also with Microsoft now. Adam has had a tremendous influence through Yammer on how organizations work and operate and how organizations digitally disrupt from the inside. Adam has a vision. Adam has a vision that he wants to share with us today. They have recently, very recently, only a couple of days ago, started a new initiative on the responsive organization, and all of us are very keen on hearing more about it. So, Adam, thank you very much.
Thank you. Awesome. I'm super happy to be here, actually. I go around talking to a lot of different groups. 2 days ago, I was talking at TechEd, which is this big tech conference. It was up in the Gold Coast. But oftentimes, the topic I always talk about is disruption. And depending on the audience, they either kind of get it or they sort of blink at me and are confused. But I was so excited. There's like a conference on disruption that I get to come talk to about disruption. And so I'm hopeful that we'll all understand. As Kai mentioned, so I'm co-founder of Yammer. When we started Yammer, the whole idea was we're going to take this thing that was in the consumer space that people were doing and bring it into the enterprise. We didn't even really know what the impact would be. But very quickly, we found ourselves kind of wrapped up in all these changes that were happening within companies. People were trying to figure out how to empower their employees, how to move faster, how to communicate differently. And so we kind of had a front row seat as these companies began to freak out about what was happening in technology, what was happening within their companies, what was happening in their workforces, and see the things that they were doing that were making them successful, see the things that were doing that were not making them successful. And it gave us sort of a unique point of view on all of this. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about what we've discovered as what I would think of as the cause of all this disruption and some of the ways in which companies are trying to handle it. But let's see if my clicker works. It does. We'll start with, I don't know, how many of you have heard of the Tower Records? A good bunch of you. All right. Tower Records is a music store, started in 1960 to sell records at the time. Eventually, they were very successful. They expanded throughout the US. They eventually expanded internationally. They moved on and innovated by selling CDs and tapes and things like that. Tower Records peaked in 1999 with sales of over $1 billion. Right around that same time, Napster launched, if we all remember that. And a little bit later, the iTunes Music Store launched. Tower Records took 40 years of rise to their peak in 1999, but they filed for bankruptcy in 2004, just 5 years later, under 5 years. And ironically, some of these services that disrupted Tower Records after 40 plus years themselves began to get disrupted just a few years later as RDO and Spotify and other online services launched. There are tons of stories about companies getting disrupted every day. The Fortune 500 actually churns at a rate of 8% a year. Only 50% of the companies that were in the Fortune 500 in 1995 are still there today. And the pace of churn is accelerating. So the first question that always comes up is, you know, I bet if you went back to business school in the 80s, we'd be talking about the pace of change. So what's the deal? Is the pace of change increasing? Is this a temporal thing? So the first question I want to answer is, why is the pace of increasing? Why does the pace of change increase in general? Our hypothesis is that the pace of change is sort of directly correlated to humans' ability to connect with each other, to the ability for information to flow freely. That what happens is, as we humans learn a new piece of information, we change our opinions on things. We change our behavior sometimes. We change our expectation. And oftentimes, we'll take a little bit of a leap and innovate in some way. And so it is the fact that people are connecting, and it is the free flow of information that is increasing the pace of change. And to prove this point, you can imagine if you went back thousands of years to distant tribes on the Serengeti, and how long it would take information about the wheel or fire to make it between these distant tribes, but how disruptive that would have been even then. We're seeing that same effect at work, just at increasingly rapid cycles. We are more connected than ever before. And of course, that doesn't answer the question of sort of, okay, that explains why the pace of change increases, but why do companies then get disrupted? Why can't companies deal with it? Well, fundamentally, it was because we didn't build companies to change. We built companies to be stable and efficient and predictable, most of all. In fact, when I talk to people at all these companies, there's this almost this sense that the way we organize our companies today, the hierarchies and process and the targets and all of that, was a discovery we had, almost like gravity, that we just found this form and we started using it. When in fact, the modern company was invented, and it was invented to solve particular problems that existed at a particular time in our history. And what problems were there? There was the Industrial Revolution, and we were trying to figure out how to create and distribute products at a global scale for the first time. But the things we did didn't change that frequently. And in fact, what I also find most interesting is that when you look back at the early writings, when we were figuring out what the shape of the modern company would be, the beliefs we had, we don't believe anymore. We believed that there was one right way to do anything, and that employees were too dim to figure out what it was, which is why we needed two classes of employees, thinkers and doers. That's what we believed. And the shape of the modern company is a reflection of those beliefs. We don't even believe anymore, and yet we sort of failed to connect now that shape of company to those beliefs that we don't have. So as we said, the environment that we lived in back then was a much more stable environment, and it was stable because information moved more slowly. Your customers didn't learn that quickly. It wasn't their fault. They weren't dim. They just couldn't communicate. I was actually thinking the other day about, I grew up in the 80s, which either makes me young or old, depending on your orientation. But I was thinking about how often I encountered new information when I grew up. I was in school, and so I would go to school, and there'd maybe be some new information, but that was usually history. I would maybe watch the news, in which case I'd get information from a central source that was like a half hour or something. But there was no internet at the time. There was no, where would new information come from? I would go weeks, months, until some event happened. I remember when the Challenger crashed. That was this new information that had an impact on the way I saw the world. That happens every day now. Every day we encounter new information that impacts the way we see the world and our expectations. But again, we didn't build companies for that. We built them with this idea that employees couldn't be trusted to figure out the right way to do things. We built it with this idea that we'd be doing the same things for 30, 40, 50 years, and the way that we would compete is by doing it efficiently, through labor productivity. These are the things we wrote about at the time. And so we created bureaucracy and process and structure. We created things for the purpose of making companies rigid, for the purpose of making them efficient, specialization. These are the things we created. That world that we lived in at the time was a world where employees were expected to primarily do what we called routine work. It was work where we could tell them exactly what to do. They didn't need creativity. They didn't need judgment. They didn't need to be self-directed. But we can see from this recent Gartner study that there has been a dramatic increase in the amount of non-routine work. They're saying that by 2015, 40% of the work that's done in enterprises will be non-routine, up from 25% in 2010. And again, non-routine means it requires judgment, it requires creativity, it requires being self-directed. Well, it's no wonder then that we see this corollary decrease in employee engagement. We have an epidemic of employees that are disengaged at work. And I think these two are completely related. You see, as employees are facing every day challenges that they're ill-equipped or unempowered to handle, it leaves them feeling disillusioned and disengaged. We're putting them in positions where we're saying, do exactly this, even though you know it's the wrong thing, even though you know you have better information. You can't give that information to anybody, and you can't do the right thing. Of course they're becoming disengaged. Why should they care about the company if the company doesn't care about the company, if the company is making them do the wrong thing? And I think this, the Deloitte Shift Index sort of perfectly illustrates the convergence of these trends, of these problems. What it shows us is that even though, in some respects, we've been getting better at running companies, productivity has been increasing for the past 40 years, return on assets, which is a key measure of performance, has been declining that entire time. Companies are getting worse and worse as they try to get better and better. And what this shows us is that push towards making companies better in traditional ways by trying to make them more efficient through more labor productivity actually makes them worse and worse as the pace of change increases. We're trying to make them more stable when the world is becoming more chaotic. Now, this kind of gets to the point of what we think is the cause of disruption. And we've talked about this in a lot of different ways, but effectively, you can look at a company as a big learning machine, a machine that takes in information and then tries to react to that information. At the largest level, that starting of the company was based on a need that was seen. And we started a company to fill that need, and then we just kept doing that. Well, customers of companies, of any organization, didn't have a lot of way of communicating. They themselves didn't learn that quickly. Like we said, me as a child of the 80s didn't get new information that frequently. But something has happened. The people of the world have begun to connect on social media. They've begun to act as a network. The feedback loops between them have increased. And yet, companies' feedback loops have not increased. Companies still operate in this model where they assume new information won't be available very frequently, therefore just focus on efficiency in each of those cycles. And so we think the cause of disruption happens when your customers essentially start having more rapid feedback loops than your company. Because they then begin changing their expectations about what you should provide them, whereas you keep investing in the wrong things. You invest in what you thought they were interested in, because it was what they were interested in, but fail to recognize those changes. It's because the companies weren't built, essentially, to learn really quickly and at the same pace of their customers. So more broadly, you could say that disruption happens when your customers learn faster than you, almost. And let's look at Tower Records again to see this illustrated. When we look back at Tower Records, it seems like it happened overnight. How could they have possibly reacted that quickly to such a large disruption? But in reality, disruption never happens overnight. There are so many signals that companies could be reading. There were people working at those stores that saw the disruption coming. In fact, somebody told me a story that right when people started to start burning MP3s, Tower Records saw an increase in returns. People were buying CDs, burning them, and bringing them back. The reaction was to change their policy so that if you opened the case, you couldn't get your money back. That was their reaction. It wasn't to figure out, oh, what's going on here? How are our customers' needs changing? It was to try to prevent them from changing their needs. They wanted the world to be predictable. And so they got disrupted because they failed to have any mechanisms whatsoever for absorbing new information and experimenting to see if there was a way they could adapt as their customers were adapting. As Kai mentioned, we've sort of, all of this has led us to a conclusion that we need to fundamentally rethink the way companies work. Now, up until this point, I've been giving you mostly bad news. It seems like there's change happening. Companies aren't built for change. We're all going to die. The good news is, and this is something that I think companies need to internalize, is that the pace of change is not different for anybody else than you. It's not different from your competitors than you, your competitor companies, your competitor people. It's not different for your coworkers. The pace of change is the same for everybody. And that means we are actually in a really unique time where there is potentially a massive competitive advantage, much larger than incremental increases in efficiency, for companies and people to start figuring out how to take advantage of this pace of change. And what we fundamentally think that means is moving away from focusing primarily on efficiency to reorienting around how to learn and respond rapidly to new information. And so we call companies that orient this way responsive organizations. They're companies that are optimizing for how to learn and respond through enabling open flows of communication, through rapid experimentation, through closer relationships with their partners, their customers, through working as a network and not just a hierarchy. These are what we call responsive organizations. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the shifts companies are making to become more responsive organizations. But first, I want to give you an example of one. They're not even a customer of Yammer's or anything. There's a fashion company called Spain called Zara. I don't know if anyone, they have stores I saw in the Westfield Mall here. So Zara is known for fast fashion. Fashion it has a temporal component. Fashion goes out of fashion really quickly. And so it matters if you can get fashion into the hands of people quickly. Now, imagine for a moment you were starting a fashion company and you were going to build the company like you'd build any other tailoristic company. You're going to make a hierarchy. You're going to break up by specialization and function. You might have a distribution division and a design division and a retail division. And the way you would bring new garments to market is you'd start in the design division and they would work on something until it's perfect, and then they'd hand it off to manufacturing, and they would work on it until it's perfect, and then hand it off to distribution. That process would take a very long time, as you can imagine. Well, Zara recognized that the way to get something done is, first of all, ignore the hierarchy. Recognize that people have to work across specializations in order to accomplish tasks. So they create cross-functional groups from people across the org that organize around a particular garment, a single garment, and stick with that until it's in the store shelf. In this way, they can innovate across organizational boundaries, and they can move so much faster. In fact, they can get a garment from design to the store shelf in under 15 days, which is unheard of in the industry. Now, I've talked about that story before as an illustration of the importance of working as cross-functional groups. And it is true that they then can get more products out faster, but that is not the most interesting part of the story. By being able to get a garment from design to the store shelf in 15 days, they've done a magical thing. They have decreased the cost of failure, which lets them increase the rate of experimentation. It means they can run smaller batches at smaller scales, see what's working, and move their resources around extremely quickly. They can say, that garment is working, let's double down on that. That one's not, let's not. They've completely changed the way that they run their company by decreasing the cost of failure so they can increase the rate of experimentation. They figured out how to organize in a way that lets them learn and respond more rapidly. Now, before we get into the steps, I want to just talk about, so what does this have to do with Yammer? It maybe is obvious to the people in this room. The communication tools you use is a piece of this, because our communication tools historically have been forced into the org chart. We don't get a chance to talk to people that we don't immediately deal with. In fact, the way work in most companies happens is you and I are in the same group and we work together, and our work benefits each other and maybe our boss. The goal of the social network, the goal of the enterprise social network, is to help companies work as networks, is to make it such that when I am working with a group of people, other people can benefit from that work by opening up that information, opening up that content and conversations, so that when somebody else I've never met, I don't even know they exist, is doing something, they can have better context based on my work to make better decisions. Because working as a network means that people from across the org are sort of required to make better decisions, as we've seen from the rise in non-routine work. So that's kind of how we got involved with this. We're sort of the communication side of that. So let's talk about some of these shifts that companies are making and try to analyze each one in terms of how it helps them learn and respond more rapidly. Again, as we said, historically, companies really cared about efficiency. They cared about predictability. They wanted to control information flow, and therefore we created hierarchies. Hierarchies to create these specializations and to control the routine work that was happening. But we're seeing that that is no longer working. So let me give you the sort of classic canonical example of where employees who are in this world of routine work fail to be able to do the right thing. Customer service. It was funny, Heather, who works at Yammer as well, got to Australia and her phone didn't work, even though she had told the phone company to turn it on for Australia. So she called customer service. The person didn't have the information, couldn't do anything about it. That's an experience that we've all had. Customer service people who maybe 20 years ago we could have given them a playbook on exactly every situation that would come up, but it's just happening too fast. It's changing too quickly for us to believe we could prescribe every moment of their day. So Nationwide is one of our customers. There was a customer of theirs who was on vacation as a family. Their RV broke down in Florida. They called the local insurance broker, who told them they weren't covered. So the customer then called Nationwide, and a customer service rep answered and actually didn't know whether they were covered either. So instead of giving up or escalating up the org chart, this customer service rep literally just posted a message in their internal Yammer network. Now, that may seem like a small thing, but that's pretty big actually for a company, to allow a lowly customer service rep to just reach out to the whole company, and in fact, for that person to feel empowered to do so. But what happened was, within moments, people from across the org, from claims and product, saw that and began to collude to figure out if there was a solution. It turns out the customer was covered, and it turns out they could figure out how to get them emergency funds to get them back on the road. What we're seeing here was a company realizing they need to start working as a network. They need to forget the organizational boundaries and realize that information is diffused throughout the entire company, and that people need access to other people at a moment's notice to pull in the resources required. Now, this makes a tremendous amount of sense when you go back to the original premise about how do you learn and respond as fast as your customers. Customers are a network now. They're not a hierarchy. They don't talk in structured ways. They're communicating on social media channels, on Facebook and Twitter, and in other means. And so how would we expect companies to be able to react fast enough when we organize them as hierarchies dealing with customers who are themselves a network? And so what we're seeing, and in fact all the information in the world is now a network. It's no longer carefully curated taxonomies. It's no longer encyclopedias. It's this giant network of information. Because it's clearly a better way of distributing information, of having information be widely available. So what we're seeing is that it takes a network to really serve a network. Back in our highly predictable worlds, we actually didn't want employees to have any control or power. We believed that, again, there was one right way to do anything, and employees couldn't be trusted to figure out what it was. Of course, the problem is it's going back to what we said before, that makes it really hard to learn any information. It makes it hard to respond very quickly when employees are powerless to do anything with the information that they get. Red Robin is a hamburger chain in the US, and it's funny because you wouldn't think a hamburger chain would care much about disruption or have to think about it. But I was talking to their CIO, Chris Laping, and they worry about it constantly. They have problems with new types of food chains. There's like the fast casual that came up and started disrupting them. And they, for a while, were trying to get people to become more of a family restaurant, but it was lower margins, and so they had to figure out how to get them back to the bar. They had all the same problems that anyone would have. And in particular, and I love this story, they were talking about the problem of changing the menu. You know, customers taste change. And so every once in a while, you have to change your menu. It's a very dangerous thing to do, though. You don't do it that often because it's so dangerous. And because you don't do it often, it's more dangerous. Because when you change it, you're not going to get to change it again for a long time. It would take them years to change the menu. They would try to do a ton of research to figure out what was going to work before they changed it. So given that they still made mistakes, they were at a crossroads. There were two things they could do. Try to make it safer by changing it less frequently, doing more research, or try to make it less expensive to fail. Change the menu more frequently, get more feedback. And that's the route they chose. The problem was, how do you get feedback? How do you rapidly get feedback when you're changing a menu? They had attempted to get direct feedback from customers through Facebook and Twitter, but customers just weren't responding. They weren't going to go to the Red Robin Facebook page to talk about a new burger. They just couldn't get them to do that. But then Red Robin realized that all of the feedback they needed was coming into the servers, the frontline employees. The employees that they had historically thought of as non-knowledge workers. They didn't have an email address. And what they realized was, wait a minute, they are knowledge workers. In fact, all employees are knowledge workers. All employees are getting new information that we need to be able to learn and respond faster. But they needed a way to empower those employees, if you will. So they literally put all of their employees, the frontline servers, on their Yammer network. And when they went to release this new burger called the Tavern Burger, they challenged those frontline employees to provide feedback faster. So they were able to do smaller scale releases in stores, empower those employees to provide feedback and respond immediately to customer concerns. And in this way, they released this Tavern Burger in 4 weeks, which was a process that would have taken 18 months. They went from 18 months to 4 weeks. Again, by empowering employees, they were able to decrease the cost of failure, increase the rate of experimentation, and respond to their customers faster. And you'll see that trend over and over. And it turns out that the best way to get information, the fastest way to learn, is by empowering employees to provide feedback. And the fastest response time is when a frontline employee is empowered to respond immediately to new information they learn. So sometimes we call this decentralization. Working as a network, empowering your employees, means that they can learn and respond in real time. Again, back in the day, we had this belief that we knew exactly what employees needed to do. And it turned out there was a very effective way of motivating predictable behavior. Carrots and sticks, rewards and punishment. And it worked. It actually did work. When you know exactly what you need people to do, you can say, if you do this, you get this reward, and if you don't do it, you get punished. And so we created elaborate incentive systems to reward and punish people for predictable behavior. Unfortunately, what the science tells us is that as work becomes more self-directed, less routine, these forms of motivation not only don't work, they become counterproductive. They, in many instances, leave these unempowered employees in a position where they are literally incentivized to do things that are bad for the company, because those incentives have sort of become obsolete faster than they can be updated. And so what's needed is really a new form of motivation for employees that is less about targets and KPIs and more about intrinsic motivation. Jamba Juice, and we sort of love these stories about the retail workers and non-knowledge workers because we tend to think mostly about knowledge workers and the creative class. But again, what we're seeing is all employees are knowledge workers. We're going to need the frontline baggers and butchers to be creative and use their judgment just as much as engineers. So Jamba Juice is a large chain of juice stores, healthy juice stores, that's partially franchise-owned, partially company-owned. And they struggle with having a consistent customer experience across all of those stores. The way they attempted to motivate that behavior, besides traditional reward and punishment, was by posting posters and signs up in the break room, do your best, have good customer service, as if they were going back there and reading it and saying, oh, now I understand, I have to do my best, It clearly didn't work. So Jamba Juice decided to run a contest, which sounds hokey, but ended up being extremely effective. It's a contest where coworkers could submit nominations for other coworkers who were exhibiting their core values. These core values, they spell it, it's fiber, it's fun, something, something. And they ran that contest on Yammer. That's how we found out about it. And the key there was that because it was public, because the whole company could see the submissions, it went viral. And hundreds of submissions from across the country came in. And what they found was that employee behavior changed because they were being motivated not by carrots and sticks, but by seeing their coworkers congratulate them on the work they were doing, by seeing their coworkers get shown how their work was impacting the rest of the company. There's this fantastic book by Daniel Pink, Drive, which talks about the way to motivate self-directed behavior is through autonomy, mastery, and purpose. It's autonomy because it's self-directed. You get to make decisions on our own. Mastery because you're learning from your own experiments and mistakes. And purpose because you can connect the decisions you're making to the greater purpose of the company. So in many ways, that is the challenge for us, is to figure out how are these incentive structures, old ones, holding us back, and how do we use autonomy, mastery, and purpose to build intrinsic motivation into these systems. The last one I want to go through is this shift away from thinking of customers and partners, be it they suppliers or distributors, as separate entities that only a small set of people within your company are allowed to talk to. This was, again, this world we lived in where we thought nothing changed, we specialized, and we can treat those as sort of separate groups. The problem is, if the name of the game is how quickly we learn and respond, then having those fixed, narrow relationships make it really difficult to work with our customers and partners as a close relationship. Westfield, which I just saw at my window here, you all know Westfield, they have all these shopping centers around the country. Those shopping centers, the retail stores in those shopping centers, share a physical space but have no way of communicating. I was actually talking with, I don't know his title, some senior guy at Westfield, and he was telling me that in the old days, a shopping center, if you will, was mostly people that own their own stores. And it was sort of a community of store owners that would come together and talk about what's working, what's not. That's how they'd work together. But in the modern shopping center, most of them are franchises. The people who work there don't own those stores. And even though you might work next door to someone for years, you may never know them or meet them. And so what Westfield did is they created these external networks, we call them, these social networks for each shopping center, where all of those retailers could join and talk to each other. What he told me, I just learned this yesterday, they created these external networks with the original idea that they could broadcast messages easily to the stores. But what happened really quickly was the stores started talking with each other. And that wasn't even the intended purpose. The stores began to act as a network themselves. There are so many examples of this. The key here, though, is that we talked about that first shift is thinking about how to turn our companies or move our companies from working in hierarchies to working as a network. That network isn't just our employees. The network of our company has to include our customers and our partners, who are all working together to provide fast feedback, and doing so because they have shared values, because they have shared purpose. That is a key way of essentially figuring out how to learn and respond fast enough. So all of these things are some of the things anyway that we think of as the shifts companies are making to be responsive orgs. We actually just threw together the site this week, theresponsiveorg.com. If you want to read the full list, there's a bunch of links on there. Simon Terry's link on there. The trick is, as an individual, whether you're a leader in the company or whether you're an individual contributor or a middle manager, is there are ways in which you can think about each of these things and how you work in each of these ways. There are ways in which you can ask, if I'm trying to solve a problem or I see a problem, am I constraining my thinking to what I can accomplish in the org chart? Am I reaching out of my group to talk to people in other parts of the org to see how we can work together? Are there ways in which we're treating our employees, or I am being treated like a cog in the wheel, where I know that I'm being forced to do the wrong thing? Or are we trying to figure out how to empower employees to solve problems on their own? Are there ways in which my company, whether the company I'm in or the company I run, is preventing collaboration and innovation through incentive structures, is using incentives as this carrot and stick that's preventing people from innovating? That's one of the key reasons companies get disrupted. Their incentive structures prevent them from seeing disruption, from innovating. And are we thinking about our customers as part of our community? I spoke at this Tech Ed conference, which was mostly IT people. And one of the big trends there is that in IT, they tend to call their customer the business. The business is their customer. And Chris Laping from Red Robin made the point that, no, the customer is the customer, not the business. That's the customer. Like, we have to work together to help the customer. And so, you know, how are we acting as if the customer is like another entity, or how can we work more closely with them? Now, when we talk about these huge shifts that are happening, moving from hierarchies to networks and all this, there are all these misconceptions and challenges. The majority of the time, people say, that'll never work, and here's why. And they bring up things like, well, you can't literally run a company through consensus, but it isn't actually what we mean. Or they think, yeah, all this experimentation you're talking about having no accountability. But it means having accountability for outcomes, not deliverables. Or they think, all this experimentation, all this iteration, you mean having no vision or plan. You mean just, and that's, in fact, you know, Yammer has this really interesting development methodology where we do 3 major releases a week, and teams work in these small ephemeral teams, 2 to 10 people for 2 to 10 weeks, and then rotate around. And when Microsoft acquired us, they looked and they said, they saw this pace of change and they thought, wow, you must have no plans. You must have no idea what you're doing. And we were like, no, 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 no. This is about having solid vision and plans, but experimenting our way there. It's about thinking about how do we prove and disprove our hypotheses towards our big plans. So it's not about having no planning. It's just about experimenting our way there. Or they think all this empowerment and networks, and you mean there's going to be no management or leadership. It may be that we're talking about very little or no management, but we're definitely not talking about no leadership. We think leadership is replacing management. Management are the people that tell their employees exactly what to do. Leaders provide a vision and a direction and then actively work to empower employees to find the best way there themselves. There's going to be more need for leadership than ever before. I think this quote from Jack Welch sort of perfectly sums up our thesis. You know, as customers have figured out how to connect, how to themselves learn and respond faster than companies, it is creating enormous tension as companies recognize that the way they've operated before, focusing on efficiency, is no longer working. The world has changed, and the old models are no longer working. As we look across all the companies we work with and seeing all the ones that are struggling and the few that are experimenting, it is obvious to me that we're on the brink of a massive change in how companies work, possibly the largest change since the Industrial Revolution. And it is people, it is actually individuals, it's not an abstract thing, it is those people like the people in this room, who are going to be able to lead the charge. It's the people who are okay with ambiguity, who have some spirit of adventure. It is the people who have an eagerness to question the status quo. But it isn't easy. I was talking to a friend of mine last week. It's a true story. And I was actually preparing for this meeting that I was nervous about, and I didn't know whether it was going to go well or not. And I said to my friend, you know, I have this nagging feeling sometimes that I'm on the verge of failure. And I thought it was sort of a personal problem. And she said, of course you do. She said, that's what it means to be on the edge. That's what it means to push the boundaries, to experiment. It means being on the edge of failure. Well, inaction is no longer a viable option. The old models are not working. And it is only by taking action that you can be the people that help lead us to be responsive orgs. Thank you very much. I guess I'm going to take some questions for a little while. How much time do I have?
20 minutes.
Awesome, 20 minutes. So, who has questions? Way in the back.
Adam, I'd just be interested to know to what extent has Microsoft adopted Yammer?
Great question. The question is, yeah, to what extent Microsoft has adopted Yammer and the Yammer philosophy. When we were acquired by Microsoft, it was this incredible experience because Yammer was a startup that had grown to about 450 people, had a lot of theories about the ways in which big companies operated. But it wasn't until we were in a big company that we began to understand more deeply how it worked. We came into Microsoft at this very unique point in time. A year earlier, a year later, I think would have been disaster. They were coming off the last 3-year release of Office. They were recognizing that everything was about to change. They didn't know exactly how, and so there was a lot of open-mindedness. But at the same time, it's obvious that taking a large company and transforming it into a responsive organization is enormously difficult. We have been, the way I look at it is Yammer has been this sort of insurgency, if you will, within Microsoft that's finding the people that recognize the need for change, are not afraid to change and doing it. So there's been a lot of interesting changes in that company. I would say Microsoft, it's a 90,000 person company. That's one of the largest software companies in the world. It is figuring it out just like every other software large company in the world. There is no large company that I've seen so far that has like really figured this out. I'm hopeful that us being there and being this insurgency means that they can figure it out as faster than others. Part of what is interesting is that they are using Yammer. When we got bought, we sort of activated their nascent Yammer network. There are 90,000 employees. There are tens of thousands that are active on the network. And they're discovering each other and learning and socially calibrating in ways that are amazing to watch within a large company. I remember right when it launched, seeing there'd be somebody who post, my phone just did this thing. Who wrote this crappy software? And then the person who worked on it would respond and be like, hey, I wrote that. What are you talking about? And it was almost like they didn't know they worked at the same company. And so there's like this social calibration happening as people learn what it means to work more transparently, figure out the importance of transparency and the fact that you have to be okay in sort of recognizing that because information doesn't have value that long, it is okay to share, even given increased risk of people criticizing you, of somebody finding out, because you need information to get to the right people really quickly. So it's a big company. They're figuring it out just like everybody else. They have one huge advantage, which is they have Yammer that's sort of, messing things up on the inside. So
Adam, a lot of organizations, I think, are becoming responsive is kind of an unnatural act.
Yeah.
And even worse, I think some organizations are terrified. Mm-hmm. What advice do you have for organizations to help them take those first steps to becoming more responsive?
It's a great question. Like everything, even if you could change it all at once, it wouldn't be a good idea. It's about starting at small scales, and it's about finding the groups within those companies that are either the most desperate or the most amenable for change, and usually those two are the same. And it's funny because there's almost this reverse selection bias happening within companies today, where we're seeing companies that are desperate, they're not moving fast enough, and they're beginning to fail, start to really experiment with new organizational methodologies, but they're too far along. And so sometimes you'll find the most experimental companies are the ones that are failing because they were already failing. And so but we are beginning to see now a lot of companies that are, again, starting at small scales. You take a group within the company and say, the most common one I'm seeing that I think is the most powerful is pick a problem, pick a business problem, and say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take people from across the company to solve that problem. And a small group, 15, 20 people. It's not the whole company. But we're going to give them autonomy. We're going to say, their managers aren't going to get to tell them exactly what to do. We're going to tell them, forget their targets, forget everything, come together to solve this problem. And seeing that happen within companies is usually transformative. I was talking, as an example, this is incredible. I was talking yesterday to, we'll say, a large Australian airline. And we were talking about the problems that they were having. There's too many meetings, nothing gets done. And they were saying, you know, the problem is the hierarchy. And that was, like, to me, it was amazing to hear him say that they recognized that. And I asked this question of, like, how did you figure that out? At what point did you figure out there was a better way of working that was cross-functional? And he said, well, a couple of years ago, we began to renovate all our buildings. We wanted to renovate all our buildings. And to figure out how to renovate the buildings, how to redo them, we just naturally brought together a group of people from across the company to talk about how they work. And that was the first big cross-functional team. And I was like, whoa, that's amazing how quick they can move. So seeing that be successful. But two, because their job was to look at how people worked, they saw that, wow, very little gets done. We have all these meetings to sort of hand work off between people. Why can't they work like we're working? Why can't they work like this cross-functional team? So it's basically starting at small scales, picking problems that are public, that people would care about if you help solve, picking solvable problems at first, proving those solutions out and expanding out. And being crisp about what happened, why that worked, why working as a network solved that problem, how how ignoring the classic incentive structures, for example, made innovation possible, things like that. Any other questions? Right there. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll use my teacher voice. Here Thank you, Adam. Thank you. I just want to add to this discussion because as an educator, I have a privilege to work with beautiful minds. And I know that you don't wake up one day and all of a sudden you become a self-empowered professional.
Yeah.
And there is also a training, inner learning that one individual needs to go through to reach the stage of being self-empowered. Some people are more natural, some people need some kind of support and training. And this is what I'm talking about. It's a longer discussion, but starting from a person who is only able to see his or her perspective, these people are very difficult to change because disruption requires you to look at several different perspectives and accept that in addition to yours, there are some other correct perspectives, and we can all benefit from differences. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that I believe that there is also a responsibility that the responsive organizations should take to help people to develop not only their skills, but to develop their minds. And it's not about giving them access to technology. It's actually very specialized type of learning that needs to happen at the universities, but also in organizations to help them to become more plural in their way of working.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that worries me the most, I was talking to a lot of companies and asking what prevents you from becoming more responsive organizations. They often answer, sometimes the technology, but mostly it's middle management that sort of doesn't want to change. And I ask, well, what are you going to do about it? And they say, you know, we'll wait till they retire or whatever, which is crazy. It's very clear that education is this huge problem because in many ways we educate people about how to enter the workforce and how to be a leader and manager in all the wrong ways. And now we're going to ask them to change that. We're going to ask them the way that you learn and were successful with is no longer going to work. And that's going to be very, very painful. One of the trends that we're seeing, and I'm hypothesizing why, but we are seeing a rise in these non-routine workers that are connecting and beginning to offer value. And one of my hypotheses is that information workers were rewarded for hoarding knowledge, that their value was in what they held, because there was that knowledge was going to have value for a long time. Well, as the half-life of information decreases, the value of that information, then suddenly we're asking them to share more. We're saying, don't hold knowledge, share knowledge. My guess is that these non-information workers weren't trained in this way. They weren't told, hey, you know, just whatever you do, don't tell people what you know because then you'll lose your value. They're just, A, they're excited to have a voice, and B, they're just natural sharers. So we're seeing some great examples where the non-knowledge workers are leading the way in how to share and iterate as a team, as a network. But it's clear to me, and I haven't figured out how, that the education system, how we teach people, whether it's to learn or to be a leader and all that, has to change so dramatically.
Do you think it's a bit more of a move away from the rote system that we still have throughout university? Having done 7 years of university myself, I know there's still a lot of rote system.
Yeah.
You have to be within that guideline parameters of the theory, of the hypothesis.
Yeah.
If you go outside that, then, and that carries on to the corporate world.
Yeah, I mean, it's education is horrifically broken at the moment because it was sort of.
Sorry, I'm sort of saying, yeah, education's great, but I think that might be why we're not doing this disrupting earlier. Because like
Well, no, I mean, I think, for example, this idea that you go to school for some years and then you leave and you go work and you never need to learn again, it doesn't make any sense. Like, they're learning how to learn, learning about constant change, learning that it's not about here are the things you need to know and you do those things and you're successful. It's like you have to constantly think about what's working, what's not, question the old things that were working and do different things. We don't teach that at all, though.
And during college, you're not asked to question things.
No.
Not even in science.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I did a science degree for my first degree, and everything had to fit the dotted line.
Right.
And if it didn't work, I won't name the university, but if it didn't work, we had to make it work. So it was like, I was really shocked by that, because that was a chemistry degree.
Yeah.
And then I went on to information and even marketing. I did a master's, and that was very similar. This is how it works in business, and these are the case studies. If you had a case study that didn't fit, then again, that wasn't used as much.
Yeah.
So it was always about... And it's the same in business. I found quite often, if you were in my companies I've worked at, if I'm a little bit out there with the thinking, which I tend to do, they kind of go, "I know that's not going to work," or "That's," and then they consider it a few years down the track because they realise that they're thinking so sort of, they're not looking at problem solving really. They're looking at those incentive schemes and the short-term gain. So.
Yeah, I think that what is going to happen is we're at a point where companies, I think most companies recognize something is wrong. We're not moving fast enough. Very, very few companies recognize there's potential solutions. We're going to see some companies, I think, inflect because they'll figure out a way to learn. We're seeing this already, I think, in startups and how quickly a company like Facebook became a $100 billion company. It's so fast. And they're going to become these proof points. And either other companies are going to figure it out or they're going to go away. There's a lot of companies that have infrastructure advantages they can hold on to for a while, but those are declining really fast too. It's very easy to manufacture things now, to distribute things. And a lot of the old mechanisms that created barriers for entry for large companies are decreasing really quickly. There's still barriers to entry if you want to build spaceships and stuff, but then again, SpaceX, less than a decade, came up and is disrupting aeronautics in space. So yeah, it's crazy. We'll do a couple more questions. Someone. Yeah, the man with the mic.
Started by educators, by academics, and you fundamentally. I need to flick that one up. That's right. Okay, does it work now? No, sorry, I can't figure out. We can hear you anyway.
That's right.
Start again. So started by educators, academics, people who've been, educating children and people like us, and you're fundamentally showing the way we need to fundamentally think differently, how we work. Now all this thing is making me think. I've got a 2-year-old at home, and she's starting to teach me a few things. What do I tell her? How do I take her forward in the next 10, 12 years to make sure she's thinking and doing the right things and not getting educated in a certain fashion which doesn't work at all? What would you say to me?
I know. I'm not yet a parent, and partially because I don't know how to answer that question yet, so I'm terrified of that. I mean, if I look at friends of mine who are parents, anyway, that are, I think, doing the right thing, it's stuff that we should know intuitively. Teaching people how to learn, how to question authority, that it's not about following the specific set of rules, but understanding why. It's hard, obviously, as a parent, because a parent is almost like a boss, in that you want them to be somewhat predictable and not, it's like but I think it's about rewriting the incentive structures for your children in some respects, and it's about thinking about how to empower them to learn, and it's probably a lot of the same principles. I'm also not a parent, and a terrible person to ask, so no.
Hi Adam, my name is Hank. Thank you very much. I think you've validated lots of the confusing things I've experienced lately. So I have a confession to make and a question to ask. I come from that control, rigidity, studied engineering, started a business, tried to put everything in those boxes and the like. A few months ago, I joined an animation company that specializes in storytelling and explaining ideas and products. And I'm surrounded by happy, empowered, intrinsically motivated people.
Yeah, terrible.
And it's sort of, and I see this happening where they are doing, I'm like, I didn't know that was the script writer's job to also do those things and the like, and it's the spontaneous, amazing things that they do. I've got a hardcore CEO, but the one thing that I've noticed is that my CEO is a woman. And I've got a suspicion that has a lot to do with it. And when you talk about leadership, isn't that perhaps what we need, is more women leaderships, more of that intuition, as opposed to try and make men and traditional leaders relearn and let go of all the control? Because it's been a hard thing for me.
I think you may be onto something, because when I think about my own journey about how I figured this out, it was because I had worked at a lot of shitty companies. And so I had been this unempowered employee and all that, and I was like, this can't be right. And so in some respects, because of gender inequality in work, it may be that women actually intuitively at the moment understand these concepts better, because they're like, well, I saw this not work. Clearly, I knew what to do and nobody was gonna let me do it. That doesn't make sense. So I hadn't thought through that line of reasoning, but it makes sense to me, because in many ways, my own journey was, in the beginning, it was less about, because I had this knowledge that there was the right way to go, so much as seeing what hadn't worked and just not wanting to repeat that. And so oftentimes what I think we're seeing is a lot of innovation in women in leadership, because they just knew the old systems weren't working. It didn't work for them, and so let's just try new things. And that sort of spirit of trying new things is what's required. From the lady in front.
Thank you. My name's Catherine. I'm just curious to see how you might see this translate into government organisations, and whether or not that...
I've thought a lot about this. All right, I have a brief answer. I have a very brief answer.
Is it realistic?
Here's my theory on this. It's a very brief answer. The name of the game is is learning and responding. And if I look across every category of knowledge and what you see is that when a particular field of knowledge or research learns how to iterate quickly, it inflects. It starts to get better really fast. And computers were this magical way for us to iterate quickly through simulation across a broad array of things, whatever those things were. But there's a couple areas we have not figured out how to iterate quickly on, government being one of them. It's a very slow iteration. Every couple hundred years, there's sort of a new experiment. And it doesn't learn very quickly. Education is another one. It's very slow to iterate. Company is another one. Companies tend to iterate a little bit faster because there's imperatives for them to do so. Ironically, and I don't know that I'd call myself a pacifist, but militaries tend to iterate faster even still because they have an imperative of life or death. And so a lot of the theories about hierarchies and networks and all that is coming out of military schools that are realizing, oh my gosh, we have to do things differently. But government is probably the most regressive. They hold so much power that there's no need for them to iterate. The trick in that line of thinking, though, is to realize that there's no end state or perfection. It's not like we just haven't found the right form of government. It's that it requires experimentation, iteration to just constantly improve, and we haven't figured out how to do that in government. We haven't figured out how to simulate it. We haven't figured out how to do it, and it's the same in education right now as well. So that's, yeah, it's really, really bad, and it's clear that like government has to work more as a network, and that is how it'll share information better. It has to have shared purpose with its customers. It has to follow all these same things, but it's less clear how it begins to make those leaps, because it will require experimentation. I guess one more question. I think we're out of time. Last one, make it quick. Who's got a really good one that's quick? I see arrows back there.
One of the questions we're grappling with is to what extent senior management needs to get involved in Yammer. Like, should a Yammer network, I mean, ideally will be allowed to grow organically and empower people, but to what extent should it be driven by the senior management or maybe the communications department or some sort of central unit in that sense?
Our experience is that Yammer networks tend to start ground up, as bottom-ups, but then run into walls and eventually like sort of peak out without any kind of top-down. It's not that it needs top-down direction so much as at least sanctioning and involvement. And in fact, the thing that seems to really drive adoption and engagement more than anything else is executive just involvement. Not direction, just seeing that executive talk to people, get involved, helps people, all throughout the chain of command will say, light bulbs go off, and oh, I see how we're using this. The CEO has more access now to the front line of communications, both to learn from them, but to motivate them as well, and that is very powerful. So I would say at the moment, given the structures we have in companies, it is necessary for a whole company to really transform, for the executives to, at some point, start leading the way. All right, I think that's out of time. Thank you again very much.